I think there are several things happening. One is the government in Baku looks at events in Ukraine of starting in November 2013, continuing through February 2014, and I think got scared by what happened in Ukraine, as Putin did, I would say. And so the Aliyev government decided to crack down on its own people to make sure that a similar kind of scenario didn't unfold inside Azerbaijan. Then you had the world's attention focused on Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, and the crisis there, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. More recently, the attention shifted to the Iran nuclear negotiations and now to the situation in Syria. So I think the reason that the visits by the two presidents, Armenia and Georgia, didn't receive much media attention here is because journalists have been distracted by these other stories that have dominated and pushed out of the news what's happening inside Azerbaijan. Still, I noticed, and I was in Warsaw for 2 weeks for the OSCE Human Dimension meeting, but I noticed while I was away, the Washington Post ran another editorial on the situation in Azerbaijan. The Post probably stands out for, at least the editorial page, for its focus and attention on what's happening in Azerbaijan, and I give great credit to the editors there for doing so. But I think the government in Baku feels that they can get away with this kind of behavior, that they can engage in the crackdown on civil society, arrest journalists and activists, sentence them to, if they aren't released and given the health condition of some of these activists, could be life sentences or death sentences. They're not paying any price. And I think President Aliyev and others have moved on from a feeling of resentment that they're not treated as part of the Euro-Atlantic community. They've gotten over the snubs, but they don't see any incentive to change their behavior. And so I don't think that President Aliyev really cared that he was not here while his two neighbors, leaders, were here. But he has to be very worried what's happening in his region, to say nothing of what's happening inside his own borders. And the tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan have not gone away. They're still there, as you mentioned, some of the incidents that have led to deaths, in fact, on both sides. And so I would argue that Azerbaijan still needs the United States, still needs Europe and the West. Of course, has to maintain a decent relationship with Moscow. It's its biggest neighbor. But the crackdown continues, the deteriorating situation inside Azerbaijan continues, unless and until the West starts imposing some costs and penalties. And that's why I favor the imposition of targeted sanctions to act as a deterrence for further crackdown there. If you take the situation in Belarus, where in 2008 Lukashenko released all the political prisoners, Europe in particular got all excited, launched an engagement process with Belarus until December 2010 with the Belarus elections, and there was an ugly crackdown against other presidential candidates and civil society activists, human rights defenders, and sanctions were reimposed against Belarus. The difference in Azerbaijan is there are no sanctions against anyone in the Azerbaijani government for any human rights abuses, whereas they have been in Belarus. And what is, I think, particularly challenging is the situation in Azerbaijan is much worse than it is in Belarus these days. Belarus, as you know, has been called the last dictatorship in Europe. I think that title could easily be applied to President Aliyev and the situation in Baku. What we're seeing different now is the crackdown has gotten much worse. And there are few people left inside the country, but outside of prison who are allowed to criticize and speak negatively about what the government is doing. So it's a much wider crackdown. The sentences that are being dished out are much more severe than they have been in the past. And they seem to continue to go after even Western organizations such as RFERL or reporters who have contributed to RFERL. So there doesn't seem to be much hesitancy on the government's part to go after anyone they deem to be a threat. And the definition of what constitutes a threat is very wide open. So I think it is a much more combustible and dangerous environment in Azerbaijan than it has been, because it will produce the very result that nobody wants to see. It will drive opposition forces to resort to different measures because the tactics that they've tried to use up to this point are being rejected by the government. But the other point I would just make is a lot of this depends on the West. Is the West going to take a firm position and decide that enough is enough, that the West needs to impose a policy or bring about a policy that would impose consequences for what's happening inside the country? So far, I don't see that the West is going to do that. That said, the mood on Capitol Hill, and let's be clear, there aren't a lot of members of the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives who pay attention to Azerbaijan, to be perfectly candid. But those who do seem to be changing in their attitude. It is becoming more critical, more concerned about what's happening. And we've seen in the past few months letters coming from Congress to President Aliyev, to the Obama administration, expressing serious concern. This kind of reminds me of 2010 on Magnitsky legislation with Russia. Magnitsky legislation was introduced in draft form in the Congress in April 2000, or the spring of 2010. It wasn't until the end of 2012 that the legislation passed, so it took 2.5 years for it to come to fruition. I think we may be at the point of 2010, the equivalent of it in Russia, for Azerbaijan. The first challenge is to make people aware of what's happening. And I think as people become more aware of the nasty crackdown inside Azerbaijan, there may be more interest in trying to do what we can to prevent it from getting even worse. I think any country or government that's a target of sanctions is always going to be dismissive and say that this isn't going to have any impact. I think there is very clear evidence in 2008 that the sanctions against the Lukashenko regime led to the release of the political prisoners. Alexander Kazulin, who was the last political prisoner released in 2008, told me personally that he believes this was the case. And it started as both U.S. and EU sanctions in 2006. The U.S. ramped up sanctions even more in November 2007, and starting in January 2008, they started the release of the political prisoners. It took a few more months for Kazulin to get released, but still, the sanctions got the political prisoners released. So we have to be clear, the sanctions are not intended to turn Belarus or Russia or Azerbaijan into a democracy. Sanctions aren't the tool to do that. Sanctions are designed to try to stop the crackdown and at least win the release of political prisoners, because if you can't get political prisoners out of jail, then you can forget trying to establish the foundations for democracy. But the sanctions that I have advocated and others have for Azerbaijan would be targeted in fashion, which is to say that they would start with judges and prosecutors and others involved in investigations of cases involving political prisoners, and then, as necessary, work their way up to higher levels in the government. I do think that people in Azerbaijan would be concerned about this. And the key to sanctions is to make it clear that they will increase if the situation does not improve, if political prisoners are not released. And so sanctions are as much psychological as they are punitive. The target of sanctions has to be convinced that he or she is going to be hit with more sanctions if he or she doesn't change his behavior. Yes, I think certainly President Obama has not shown any interest in having a photo op with President Aliyev. Now, to be clear, unless this happened on the margins of the UN General Assembly or elsewhere in Washington, I don't think the presidents of Georgia or Armenia had a meeting with President Obama either. I don't know if they had meetings with Vice President Biden. This happened while I was away. But I think someone like President Aliyev would only want to come to Washington if he was going to be greeted in the Oval Office by President Obama. And even though the Obama administration has shown no interest in sanctioning the government in Baku, I think they realize they don't want an Oval Office visit. I think Azerbaijan needs the United States more than we need Azerbaijan, frankly. It needs it to balance its relationships with Iran and with Russia. And you've had 3 U.S. officials recently visit Baku. One who's involved on energy issues, another who's involved on Trans-Caspian issues, and then an official from the Pentagon. She has since announced that she's resigning from her position. I don't think it's related to her visit to Baku, but she was there talking about strategic partnership with Azerbaijan, and if she's leaving, I don't know who else in the Pentagon is going to spend the time and effort to talk about strategic partnership with a country that on human rights is clearly going in the wrong direction. So I think Azerbaijani officials should be concerned that the United States is very preoccupied with other issues, not paying a lot of attention to what's happening in Azerbaijan. They think maybe that means they can get away with their crackdown. But if members of Congress start focusing, the Congress can become a force to push on sanctions and for a tougher line on Azerbaijan. The raid on RFERL's offices in December last year was both ill-advised and counterproductive vis-a-vis the relationship with the United States. That is, I think, what got some members of Congress who hadn't been paying close attention to focus on what was happening on Azerbaijan. Of course, Hadija Ismailova's case, the Yunus's case, and others are now coming into the fore, and so members who are paying attention are realizing the situation there has really gotten ugly. And that the United States probably needs to take a tougher position, and I think that's where we're headed. Not since 2008, in fact. Look, at the end of the day, he's responsible. He's the president of the country. And he was elected, granted in an election that was widely criticized in October 2013. But his chief of staff in December of last year issued this, 60-page manifesto attack against the West and the United States. That's his chief of staff. Now, granted, it's a chief of staff who worked for President Aliyev's father. But President Aliyev either needs to assert himself if he thinks things are going in the wrong direction, or he's responsible for it. And my view is he's responsible for it. If he was so concerned about the direction things were heading in, he would have put a stop to it already. He knows the United States well. He knows the West well. He speaks perfect English. He reads English. He can follow what's happening in terms of the coverage and reaction in the West to what's happening inside his country. Either he is unable to rein in some of these forces around him, or he chooses not to do so because he actually agrees and supports what they're saying. I mean, in certain respects, obviously, Azerbaijan is much better than it was 2 decades ago. Economically, it's done much better. That's largely due to the price of oil and its ability to tap into energy resources. But in terms of the human rights and political situation, it's much worse. I do think the explanation for the latest crackdown really originates in Ukraine with the Maidan revolutionary movement, the decision by Yanukovych to flee. It wasn't a coup, but Yanukovych fled the country. I think that scared Aliyev. I think it scared other officials in Baku. I think it scared Putin. Putin decided to respond by invading Ukraine. Aliyev has decided to respond by cracking down on opponents and critics and journalists. But what we're seeing is really unprecedented in Azerbaijan since the breakup of the Soviet Union. The scale and scope of the crackdown is much worse than we've seen before, and I'm very worried about where it's going, because he's driving away independent voices, he's driving away civil society, he's driving away journalism, and so some people will think that opposition to Aliyev can only come in extreme forms, and that's not good for anybody. Well, I mean, beyond Azerbaijan's own history and experience with Putin, if they haven't learned anything from Putin's invasion of Ukraine, then they're in big trouble. I think all of Putin's neighbors are very nervous by what's happened to Ukraine. And Putin also realizes that Russia has a long-standing relationship with Armenia. Armenia is very dependent on Russia for security. There's a base in Armenia, a Russian base. And so Putin also can't turn on Armenia and solve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in Azerbaijan's favor, because then he runs the risk of losing Armenia. Armenia is one of the countries that has agreed to sign and join the Eurasian Economic Union under tremendous Russian pressure. Like Ukraine, it reversed its intent to sign the agreement with the European Union. So Putin, I think, tries to balance the interests Russia has with Armenia, with Azerbaijan. He'd love to be able to control both, and it will be up to Azerbaijan whether it closes the door to the West itself. The West isn't seeking to close the door to Azerbaijan. The question is whether Aliyev is going to close the door to the West, in which case he's left dealing with Russia on his own, dealing with Iran on his own. And in light of the nuclear deal with Iran and the number of ethnic Azerbaijanis living in Iran, how this plays out is hard to envision. So Azerbaijan lives in a tough neighborhood. It can't change its geography. It has to coexist with Russia and Iran. But it is a choice on whether it wants to have good relations with the West. And it seems that Aliyev is making a decision and a choice not to have good relations with the West. And I think that's very unwise.